warming. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that cap and trade will cost the average American household only $175 a year. Yes, because that study was authored by the rainbow pony flying out of Barack Obama's butt. Sparkle! But the Heritage Foundation says by 2035, the program will cost the average family $1,500 a year. But the EPA says $80 to $100 a year. But the American Petroleum Institute says $3,000 a year. But Sally Struthers says we can do it for just $1 a day. Point is, it's going to cost money, and we cannot afford that in a recession. That's no excuse to, recession. But our grandchildren, recession. You're just saying recession to everything recession. Look, no matter how much money you have, you still need a planet to live on. Not true. I believe if you are rich enough, you can shed your mortal form, become a being of pure money, and live forever inside Quicken. You believe that, but you don't believe in global warming. Well, I do now, because an inconvenient truth made money. The market has spoken. Global warming is real. So, what's your plan? Do nothing. Stephen, a crisis calls for moral courage. What's more courageous? Jumping off a track when you see a train coming, or standing your ground by ignoring it? You're just going to ignore global warming? Nope. I'm gonna let the free market fix it. Even Al Gore says that new economies will emerge to fix this problem. So we should just crank up the air conditioning and wait for that to happen. Al Gore did not say that. Oh, really? I happen to have his new book. Oh, really? I happen to have Al Gore. Mr. Vice President.
Stevens.
Hello.
Stephen with the red tie. Stopping global warming doesn't have to hurt our economy. In my new book, Our Choice, A Plan to Solve the Climate Crisis, available now from Rodale Press, $26.95, I lay out bold ideas that, if implemented, will not only reduce man's carbon footprint, but create new jobs and reduce our dependence on foreign oil.
Ha! Not so fast. Al?
Hello there, Al. Hi, Al. Have you lost weight? No, I just started wearing bigger suits. Genius. Thank you.
Al, tell them how fighting global warming comes with a price tag.
Not nearly the price tag we'll pay for doing nothing. In my new book, Our Choice, A Plan to Solve the Climate Crisis, available now from Rodale Press, $26.95, that's a great price. It is. I lay out the dire economic consequences of not acting now.
Ha! Shut up! What dire economic consequences?
Rising sea levels could flood Mumbai, Manila, Washington, D.C., even New York. Remember, this studio is only 2 blocks from the water.
And only 4 blocks from the Hustler Club. Oh my God. Well, we'll do what humans always do. We'll just adapt to the new situation.
Okay, let's give that a try.
What's this for? Is he adapting?
He doesn't seem to be growing any gills.
Well, I'm convinced you, sir, are a formidable opponent.
We'll be right back.
so the heightened awareness about climate has also made this more a part of debate. And so somebody was saying to me before the lecture that like climate's on every topic, and that's kind of true, that it can be an impact to lots of different arguments. But the reality is that this topic in particular is so timely because of the discussions about climate change. There was just last year a big international climate conference, and some follow-on activities are happening with that, so there's going to be even more discussion. And then, like we were just saying, transportation is a super important element of the climate debate. So let's start to talk then about that climate debate. All right, the first part of the climate debate is the science debate. Now, to be real clear about this, I don't think that the most strategic science debate for you to have on both sides of the topic is there is no climate change. There is climate change. Things are warmer. I'll show you a chart in just a bit about that sort of demonstrates that. The real question when it comes to the science debate is how we measure and human contribution. So the science question isn't, is the world warmer? Because as an objective fact, you can measure that there has been a temperature increase. What I just said is a little bit of an overstatement. There is some debate about that, but mostly there is acknowledgement that things are warmer. The question then is whether or not, hey, kid whose head is down, you have to see the screen. Really? Why don't you go get a drink of water and then come back in all rejuvenated. Go. Alright, so where was I? This is why you should not speak. No, it's hard to you in front of everyone. Yeah, so the question of increasing the temperature, you know, that question is really a less interesting question. There's less of a robust debate about it. The real question is about, one of the other questions in the science debate is ways to measure whether or not climate change is occurring. And then we're going to talk more about the human contribution here in a second. There are basically two ways to evaluate whether or not climate change is happening. One is observational data, and then the second way is through climate modeling. Some of you may have taken part in the observational data debate last year. Did any of you run Earth or climate monitoring satellites or joint polar satellites? Raise your hand. Raise them high. Raise them high. Interesting. That was more popular, I guess, than in some areas of the country than in others. But that app from last year was really all about this observation of climate trends. And one of the big controversies is over how to measure the surface temperature. There are some people who make the argument that we shouldn't actually use surface temperature as a measure of climate because urbanization has made things appear hotter. Have y'all ever heard that phrase, heat island? Yes. Heat island? Okay. You might want to jot that phrase down then, heat island. Heat island refers to, in urban areas, like all the concrete and stuff, like makes it appear hotter. consumption patterns, contributed to climate change through their consumption patterns. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but the other side of this debate is that climate change is a naturally occurring phenomenon. Naturally occurring phenomenon that means that doesn't really matter what we do, there's going to be climate change. It's how it's supposed to be, decreed many moons ago on like stone tablets or something. Gonna have climate change, it's inevitable, whatever. Now, why do you think that's an important debate? Human caused versus this is inevitable. Yeah. Speak up. Exactly, that latter part's super important. So if you think about what the app and the neg are trying to do, the app is trying to prove that the benefits of change outweigh the cost of change. The next big question or the big statement that they want to make is that the cost of change outweighs the benefits. If the neg, for example, can win that climate change is naturally occurring, that it's inevitable, it's all good, then that helps them to win that the costs outweigh the benefits. Because if the app wins that humans are the ones that have contributed to it and that they're the ones that are causing it, then the app is in a better position to justify whatever change they're advocating. And I think if you framed the debate in that manner, that would really help you to be able to resolve some of these issues. It would help you to be able to resolve whether or not the judge should vote for solving climate change or not solving climate change. Does that make sense? Do y'all see how that's a much more nuanced way of addressing that than climate's not real? Yeah? Okay. Item next. These are the arguments for yes, it is anthropogenic. First, and some of this may seem kind of basic, but it is an important part of explaining your arguments to be able to identify and understand this. More importantly, if you're cutting cards on this, there's some really good cards from 2011 and 2012. My lab's doing the climate file. We are striving to only have 2011, 2012 cards instead of recycling old climate files. And so, see how that goes. And so that process then of being able to explain all of this is going to help you in this debate. So the first way that people argue that it is anthropogenic is by virtue of the kind of emissions humans have. CO2, what's CO2? It is a greenhouse gas. It's carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide is the primary component part or the primary thing that they blame when it comes to emissions and causing the greenhouse gas. Now I should say, maybe I should have said this a moment ago, there is something on Earth called the temperature equilibrium. Temperature equilibrium. If something is in equilibrium, what does that mean? It's in balance, yeah. And so as a normal, life exists on Earth because sun comes in, Earth absorbs some stuff, sends some energy back out into space, creates the perfect biosphere. Okay? So a big part of this climate debate is that something gets wonky in there and it shifts the equilibrium so that we're bringing in too much and we're not sending enough back out. And so the CO2 stuff then is important because the CO2 alters that equilibrium by trapping energy. CO2 goes up in the atmosphere, creates, essentially a trap of that heat. That's the greenhouse effect, yeah? Make sense? Okay. Second source of climate-inducing stuff, climate change-inducing stuff is methane. We'll talk about this. How many of you have ever said climate change inevitable cows? Nice. We'll talk about that in a moment. Cows emit methane, as do landfills. So methane then is a second greenhouse gas, a second source of stuff that traps that energy and shifts the equilibrium. All right, consumption patterns cause these gases to be emitted. What do I mean by consumption patterns? Yeah. How we use what? Yeah, so consumption patterns are a couple of things. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase carbon footprint. Dakota, did you hear me? greenhouse gas and climate change as well. And so when we fly places, if you're on a team that is able to fly places to tournaments, then you are contributing. So debate community has a big carbon footprint. Those individual decisions or collective decisions about consumption, that can result in additional expenditures into the atmosphere. I will also say that some of this is indirect, right? Electricity. Most of the power in the United States is generated via coal-powered electrical plants. Have you ever heard the phrase clean coal? Okay. Like, coal is coal. There's not like magical coal. There's no like dust to sprinkle on the coal to like be like, and now you are clean. So the process of generating that electricity, even if it comes from so natural forcing. So you can see that, for most of this time period, the models show that it's basically the same. And then this is actually the debate right here, is over whether the reason for this split off is human behavior influencing climate change, and that the argument is it would just have continued to be at this level if humans had not contributed. Okay, second part of the debate is the rate debate. Rate debate. I'm going to first talk about the tipping point is close part of the debate. Tipping point refers to a moment in time where we cannot go back. You all are at a tipping point with regard to the dorm. That's right, I just did that. Okay. And that's right, full circle, full circle. So the tipping point is a moment in time from which you cannot return. Climate change, proponents of changing things to avoid climate change make the argument that we are quickly approaching the tipping point. That even if people are right, that right now there is not substantial warming or there are not substantial impacts, these individuals make the argument that we are closely approaching that tipping point. Yeah?
Would the tipping point be like right before the moment for that?
Sure, thank you for your precision. Other questions? Okay. So the tipping point moment then is significant to the climate debate because teams, especially on the app, that are arguing that climate change is real bad, they're going to make the argument that we don't know when that tipping point is. There are models that try to guesstimate when the tipping point is, but we don't know. We don't have a Mayan calendar for this. Y'all know really this topic doesn't matter except for like 6 months because in December, yeah. I know. I know. Yeah. You know the very best part? When you all get sleepy and tired, then you're like, ha! I will seize on anything. Alright. So it is in fact the case that the Mayan calendar has been debunked because there's a cave that went far. There's some debate about that. My opinion is that it's pretty convenient that in 2012 they located this cave. Actually, they located the cave about, I think, like 10 or 15 years ago. But now they finally understand the cave, just in time to avert anarchy. Interesting. Yes? I'm 13 right now. Really fantastic, and thank you for sharing. So tipping point. Nice, 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 that's nice. Alright, so evidence for reaching the tipping point. There are lots and lots and lots of indicators of the tipping point lots of indicators of the tipping point that people identify. I'm going to show you one, and that is the Greenland ice sheet. Remember, Greenland's the one that's ice, and Iceland's the one that's green. Have you ever heard that? Okay, so one of the things that people talk about is the ability of the ice caps to reflect back energy. This particular model shows, or this particular picture shows, the decrease in Greenland's reflectivity from 2000 to 2011 versus June of 2012. And you can, if you're interested in any of these charts, you can always go back and look at them. But basically what this is trying to demonstrate is that the ice sheet is having some difficulty in reflecting back out. Remember we talked about how energy comes in and it gets reflected out, and that creates equilibrium. If there is a shrinking number of surfaces which can reflect back out, then that throws the equilibrium out of kilter. Does it make sense when I say it like that? And so that's what this pretty blue shows. Okay. Another important element of the tipping point debate are called feedback loops. that enhance climate change, and warming, things that decrease it. So, for example, the Amazon rainforest helps with negative feedback loops. And what I mean by that is it sucks up carbon because there's trees, and so that helps to decrease the risk of warming. Okay. Then there are some things that trigger more warming. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So I want to show you some models that project the way that the rate debate is happening, and also show the ways in which action may or may not be significant. Okay. Yeah, y'all can see that pretty well. Okay, so this is Think Progress. It's a think tank and a blog that does a bunch of different stuff, but their climate one on the left there, from your perspective, these are warming possibilities in 2100 under no policy scenario. We don't do anything. On the right are warming possibility scenarios under policy. We do something to try to mitigate policy. So you can see that if we do some change, according to the one on the right, if we do some change, then there will be a change in the global mean temperature that will be less than the change if we do nothing. This is the tipping point debate. The argument amongst policy advocates is we need to back off of the tipping point in order to ensure that the rate is not as significant as it would be if we did nothing. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah? Okay. Also, they use very angry colors in the no change. That also demonstrates the closer we get to the tipping point by doing nothing, the more likely it is that bad things will happen. Okay. This is a picture that highlights some of the tipping pointness. The first is a picture of the ice in the Arctic Sea in September of 1997 or 1979, and then the other is in September of 2007. You can see that this whole chunk has melted, and that's a permanent melt. And the reason why you know this is comparable is that it's both from the month of September. How many of you watch Deadliest Catch? Okay, so you know when they're in crab season and they're like going north, sometimes the ice floe comes to them and their boats get trapped and stuff. Have you seen any episodes where they get trapped in the ice? Okay, so the ice floe, there is a natural ebb and flow to it because there are seasons, but this demonstrates that when you do similar month comparisons, that highlights the shrinkage of the ice. Okay, the other side of the debate is that it's slowing or that it's irreversible. This fate can happen in a couple of ways. It can happen that there is a smaller temperature differential than people actually have measured. So there are advocates on this side of the debate that say that the measurements and the projections of how much temperature is going to increase is actually shrinking. It's getting smaller. That projection is about a 3 and a 4 degree increase. Not accurate. It may just be a 1 or a 2 degree increase. And people use that argument to say, look, we don't need to act now. We can act later because the temperature increase is actually manageable. The other part of this debate is that the temperature changes and concentrations are just irreversible. They're happening. Maybe humans caused them, but it's totally irreversible. For those of you that are familiar with the climate debate, when do a lot of people say the carbon got into the atmosphere that is currently causing the temperature increase? Anybody? Interesting. Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, I think they tried to make more smoke. They just were like, hey, let's put some more coal in. This coal stuff's really super awesome. Let's burn some more. They meant more. There were no regulations, right? And so a lot of people argue, and this change is irreversible, make the argument that we've already dumped the carbon into the atmosphere. You can't get it back. You for sure going to happen. The significance of this then in this debate is it's important about whether and what change is justified. That's going to be important later because I'm going to talk about some counterplans that you'll hear if you run warming, or that you can run if you're debating warming. And so you can make some arguments that even if the app wins that the rate is important, that what you do to solve it, you could take a longer time to do it than what the app is advocating because tipping point's further away, or we've already contributed and we need to do something to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere as opposed to try to prevent new carbon. Okay, scientific consensus. I put both sides of this debate on this one slide. There's a big debate over whether or not scientists agree about climate change. Have y'all heard this debate? A little bit, right? This is one of the debates that's in the popular media quite a bit. So the debate is over these models and observations and whether there's scientific consensus about the conclusions and about the structures. Conclusions and structures. So, in other words, there's some debate over whether scientists agree over the predictions and the conclusions, or whether they agree about how to model stuff. I have a card. I have multiple cards. I only have time for one. Actually, before I do that, what's the value of consensus? Why do you think this is a part of the debate? Who cares? Who cares what a bunch of people sitting in a lab who don't have social skills because they're scientists? What do you think? Yeah? Okay, but you remember Copernicus? Copernicus? Yeah? Alright. So he was the one who was like, actually the Earth is not the center of the universe. Did he have a consensus when he initiated that argument? No. So you've got to, when you're engaging in this debate, be able to articulate why it is significant that scientists agree one way or the other. I think you could say a couple of things. I think it's significant that scientists agree that there is climate change because that proves that the Earth is warming and that your impacts are likely. If there is not a consensus about how to address climate change, then you can make the argument there are other ways to do it besides the app plan. You could also make the argument that who cares about consensus? Copernicus. You should just say that today. But Copernicus. Anybody know what an enthymeme is? Enthymeme? It is a big word. An enthymeme is a statement that people can finish for themselves. So it's a statement or an idea that people can complete the thought for themselves. So when I say Copernicus, what immediately comes to mind? Breaking with tradition, saying, something that was unpopular, being, having retribution, right? When I said Copernicus, almost all of you that were awake knew what I was talking about, right? Yeah. That would be an example of where for some people that would be an enthymeme, but because it isn't for everybody, then it's not really an enthymeme. That's an enthymeme for me, but okay then. Enthymeme. E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. Enthymeme. Alright, you ready for my card? Okay, this is on the consensus, climate change, human stuff. Okay. This is from May of 2012. There's been a big debate, as I mentioned, about whether there actually is consensus or not. Lieberman is a science and environmental writer. An innovative sampling of a small group of climate scientists' perspectives suggests their views may be more commonly shared among their science colleagues than they thought. More than 2 decades, widespread doubts persist in the United States over whether there really is widespread agreement among scientists. It's the primary argument for those who deny basic scientific foundations of warming. change, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere will exceed 550 parts per million between 2050 and 2059. More than 30% agreed, but those respondents estimated that just over 20% of their peers held that view. And then the card goes on to do that about other parts of the science debate. Now, why is that significant? Why would it be like, that is a good card? Why is that significant? All right, what was that card saying about views on climate? Is there consensus or is there not consensus? There is consensus, right? There is consensus. Consensus doesn't mean that like everybody agrees. Consensus is that like most people agree. Okay. Why was it significant that this study found that people underestimated the why is it significant that the scientists underestimated who agreed with them? Yeah.
They thought that people didn't really agree with them.
Right. Why is that significant?
Because more people are right. They're not right.
No. Yeah. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. All right. I would like, actually, time out. I would like everybody to stand up. Okay. Without knocking your desk computer or your neighbor, I would like for you to jump up and down 3 times.
Oh, you're
And not standing up. Stand up.
In the back, they're like, no one can see me. You wrong.
So, why is it significant that scientists themselves underestimated how much their colleagues agreed with them? Raise your hand if you have no idea why it's significant. No idea whatsoever. Okay. Well, that's only a handful of people, so everyone else should have their hands up. Why is it significant that scientists underestimated that? Christina? Yeah, so it may impact the ability of people to find articles and to write articles because they think that they're going to be wrong. I think I read the rest of this article makes the argument that the essence of scientific method is part of the reason why scientists like think that there's not consensus when there actually is. In other words, scientists are so used to questioning themselves and others via the scientific method. Y'all know the scientific method? Yeah. Okay. That's the reason why they're like super skeptical. Yeah. She has a PhD. Voila. Okay? No. And by the way, I'm not going to write debate cards. Even when it's been in areas of my actual specialization, I don't write debate cards because I have a vested interest. So the thing to remember about the qualifications debate is you want to make sure that they're qualified in the area of climate change. It's unclear what I'm qualified in, but it is definitely not climate change. Make sense? Okay. Sources of funding for studies is another important part of this debate. Oil companies fund studies. What sorts of conclusions are they hoping come out of that study? Climate change not so bad, it's naturally occurring, slowing, all that stuff. Hippies also fund studies. What kind of conclusion do you think the tie-dye hippies want? Exactly. You are going to cause extinction. Okay? So you want to be clear about what studies you're citing from. And there are conspiracy theories a go-go. Lots of conspiracy theories about climate. Kind of like the conspiracy theory, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the Fast and Furious, the gun program, not the movies. The gun program where the U.S. government allowed guns to be sold in Mexico so they could track them. So now the conspiracy theory about that is that a program that started in 2006 was allowed to continue by the Obama administration so that they could say that the gun problem was so bad and then they could have more gun control. This is a conspiracy theory, totally not born of any reality. Lots of those things exist when it comes to climate change as well. Okay. The impact debate. This is, in fact, a part of the debate. I know. In my opinion, on this topic, this is not the most interesting part of the debate. To me, the most interesting part of the debate is not do you or do you not stop an ice age. The more interesting part of the debate are, do the alterations to transportation infrastructure affect climate or not? That debate is much, much more interesting than the recycled impact debate. Benefit of debate, every year the topic changes, you get to investigate some new element of it. There are also more or less credible arguments on both sides, actually. And so you want to evaluate that. And as I just mentioned to you, you really do need to know on these impact debates, you need to know the methodology of the studies that are being done. For example, some of the original ag studies that were done on the climate change good side of the debate, where they were like, agriculture will flourish in a world of more carbon. The people who did that study, it's a family, they like set up a lab and they grew some plants. See my plants? Okay. And then, do you know those pump air things like this? Okay. So they basically like took some carbon and they went like this in front of the plants. That it does not simulate climate change. Does everyone get that? Yeah? Okay. So that doesn't really simulate climate change, and you want to think about the methodology for those studies. By the way, that's the same logic. Have you ever heard that talking to your plants makes them grow? Okay, so the explanation for that is like carbon, CO2 is coming out of your mouth, and it like makes the plants happy. Does that make sense? I don't know, but if you see Dan Lingle walking around ever at the workshop, Dan Lingle coached that Jesuit, I'm also married to him, he looks Mythbuster-like, and particularly when he wears that particular pair of glasses he has, he gets stopped in public, and people are like, are you the Mythbuster guy? And one time we were at a Boston Red Sox game, families coming up the stairs, they're like, hey, you're the Mythbuster guy. And he's like, I get that a lot. And I think they thought that it was the actual Mythbuster guy, like, trying to be cute about it, and, but it wasn't, and they were like, really, are you? He's like, no, I'm not, in fact. Well, potentially. Then we'd be inundated with more autograph, questions than we already are. I don't know, the one with the goatee and the, he looks like a combination, maybe. I digress. Impact debate. Climate change is real, real bad. You know what I did there? Oh, good lord. Sea level rise. One of the biggest impacts, I'm going to talk the oceans. And then secondarily, the expansion of the water molecules. Warmer water gets bigger. So the first part of this, I already showed you a couple of those ice sheets. When ice melts, it becomes water. Is this revolution? Did I just blow your mind? Should say it. The glaciers melting, sea level rises, the ice sheets melt, sea level rises. There's just more volume in the water, in the ocean. That also increases the heating of the water, also expands water as well, and that also can cause additional sea level rise. This is another indicator, by the way, of tipping points. There's some new studies out that melting of some of the glaciers, once it reaches a particular point, it's going to melt even faster, and you can't get that back, right? Glaciers can't refreeze. I mean, technically they could, but the conditions of the world are not going to facilitate a refreezing of the glacial water. And so that's another good example of that tipping point argument. If there is enough melting, it causes sea level rise, and you can't go back on that. This is the world. Sea level temperatures. You can see obviously along the equator it's designed to be warmer, or not designed to be warmer, but it is warmer because it's the equator. And so that's the intensity there. But you can also see that there's lots of places here that are warmer. I don't have a comparison to show you, but this highlights that there are areas that are getting warmer. It also means that in these areas of warm water, the water is expanding. This is relative to the United States, how sea levels have risen. The blue or brown is greater than 8 feet. You can see along this part of the country. From 1958 to 2008, there's been more of an increase in sea level rise. You can see here in the densely populated area of the Northeast Corridor that there also has been an increase of 4 feet or 6 feet, and in some areas that 8 feet as well. You can see that there are a couple of areas where the sea level has actually gone down, and that has to do with the shifting of the tectonic plates and whatnot is my basic understanding of it from reading that down. All right, a couple of other things. Flooding results from that sea level rise. Something like 70% of the world's population live in coastal areas. I think I'm roughly right about that number. And so if you have sea level rise, then that can increase the chance that those areas will be flooded. Coastal flooding is a real problem. There are some countries like Bangladesh, which sit below sea level anyway, and as sea levels rise, that gobbles up some of their coastal areas and city areas as well. Flooding can also result from torrential rains, and the reason for that is the second impact, which is erratic weather. Part of the reason why people have started to call it climate change and not global warming is that one of the things that happens with climate change, according to these authors, is that there's more erratic weather. Erratic means vacillating, that's not helpful at all. Erratic means changing a lot. So some of you have erratic personalities where one moment you are super perky and the next moment you have bottomed out. Okay? The weather is similar. There are some areas where there's a lot of intense rain and there are some areas where there's droughts. There are places where there are intense hurricanes or typhoons, or there are other areas where there's not. And so that erratic weather is also part of the problem. It means that it's difficult to prepare for those impacts, and that's why death results from erratic weather. It is unlikely you would claim climate change bad, erratic weather, and that be it. You would probably then read an additional impact that erratic weather can actually cause people to die. Yeah?
Is that why we're
Well, the intensity and the duration of the drought in Texas is more than it has been historically. Do you all see how it may exacerbate existing climate conditions in a particular area, and that's what makes it worse? All right, famine. You can't grow stuff if there's no water. Diseases. Hotter weather intensifies diseases. Also makes pests more likely, which can eat the ag as well. Migration. If you are in an area which is flooded, you probably are going to move. As a result of that, there are migration patterns that happen that may be substantial and disruptive. This can also affect the economy. The national security stuff is real interesting to me. The DoD in 2008, I think, if you send me an email, I'll tell you the exact site to the report, but the DoD did a report where they said that the single greatest security issue confronting the U.S. in the 21st century was going to be climate change. The military, right? They probably know. And so that, the intensity of all those other things is part of the reason why the DoD claims that, or according to their study, that it's the biggest security threat. Yeah. I'm sorry, what? It wasn't a statement, it was a thorough study in which they outlined why climate change would intensify existing conflicts and potentially create new conflicts, particularly because of things like migration, water shortages. Do y'all have a mental map of the Middle East in your head? Okay. Everything's packed real close together. There's a couple of water sources. So this is my mental map. Here's Israel. Here's all the countries around Israel. River Jordan comes through it as one of the primary sources of water in that region. If water becomes scarcer, countries upriver have an incentive to close off access to that water because they want to keep it for themselves. That means that countries can fight each other over things like water. That's the logic of water wars, which is an impact to all of this too. So they weren't just like, okay, everybody, climate change. They did a pretty thorough study and then identified ways in which it would exacerbate. Other questions? Okay. Then on the other side, I'm sorry. If you lose the rate debate on this climate bad stuff, you could go for ocean acidification. Ocean acidification. When CO2 dissolves in the ocean, it acidifies the ocean, killing marine life. So if you lose the rate debate, you could still win the debate on ocean acidification, in my opinion, because you can win that there's still carbon emissions, seeps into the ocean, kills marine life. That doesn't matter whether we're increasing by 5 degrees or 4 degrees or 3 degrees. All that really matters is that there's carbon being emitted into the atmosphere that seeps into the ocean. Questions about that? Okay. And this shows you the shift in acidification in the ocean. Okay. Some people say that climate change is real good. A few of these arguments, ice age. This argument is that cyclical patterns in the Earth's history mean that there are periods of warming and periods of cooling. We need our period of warming in order to prevent another ice age. I have no idea what I meant by saying. Oh, no, I don't know. So you can see that this ice age impact, the impact of ice age is like, we died. Do you see how being cold would be bad? Indeed. It makes it difficult to grow food. You definitely, if you're on the other side of this debate, you definitely can make the argument that it is easier to adapt to the cold than it is to the hot. And that you could build greenhouses to build your food so that there would not be famine, things like that, and that it would not cause the collapse of civilization in the same way that runaway warming would. Okay. Another argument in the climate good section is that melting leads to revelations. What I mean by this is, particularly in the Arctic, there are areas that were previously covered by ice that are no longer covered by ice. This has revealed actual land that the Russians have stuck a flag in. And so they are going there because there is a lot of oil, natural gas, other minerals that are good and important to them. And so this Arctic debate is an important one. And there are other places that are melting that's revealing stuff. And so you can also, by the way, make this this argument the other direction too. You could say that the fight over resources that are being revealed by climate change is also bad, and that it's going to exacerbate conflict. So there's a lot to be done with that, I think. All right, the next climate good is ag. That's short for agriculture. This is the idea that you can grow more if we're warmer. And there's two ways that this works. One is it lengthens the growing season. Lengthens the growing season. Also makes it come earlier so you can replant. Any of you from Missouri or from Kansas? Okay, so I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri. When I was in college, my mom moved to this one stoplight town where they removed the stoplight for a lack of traffic. The last 2 years, the growing season has backed up almost a full month, so that stuff that they used to be able to harvest at the beginning of June, now they're actually having to harvest in like early May, winter wheat, for example. And so some of that stuff is also a way that this may add to the ability of people to adjust their growing season. It also shifts upward where you can grow stuff, so it stays warmer longer in the north of the United States and in southern Canada, so you could grow more stuff there. And then, as I said, it also may carbon is like steroids for plants, and so it can also intensify the size of the crop and produce more stuff as well. I have not spoken a lot that this means more food and not famine. Does everyone get that that's the terminal impact of that? Okay. Here's a demonstration of that shifting. You can see it's pretty subtle here, but, not for the people that live there. All right, you can also make arguments on this side of the debate that climate change is not so bad. We can adapt. We can migrate. It's too hot, you move. The answer back to that migration and adaptation stuff, by the way, is we may be able to do that, but species are not. And while, the squirrels may want to run north, they may not have the same ability to do that because they don't have squirrel cars. Yes?
The impact of climate change on the anxiety being
Who knew if I talked about squirrels that would get you all going so much? I apologize for not using that earlier. Sorry, could you start again?
do you have a ridiculous impact on the egg things that let people figure at night?
That is not ridiculous. Penguins are important. In fact, the emperor penguin is now is now close to being extinct. Oh no! Happy feet, apparently not. One of the things you could do to try to address that would be climate change counterplans. There are two ways to accomplish this. The first is you can have counterplans that actually solve climate, solve the impact. One thing would be to get more carbon sinks. This is like planting more trees. Yeah. Yes. Well, no, that's proof that it is bad. But so there's a phrase that's sometimes used called keystone species. There are criticisms of that concept, but basically the idea is that there are certain species that are so significant to all the things around it on the food chain or the web of life thing, that if you take it out and it goes extinct, that could affect everything else. And so it may not be the case that emperor penguins are if they die, that there's some that causes human extinction, but if it alters everything, then all right. Carbon sinks suck up the carbon. Plant a tree, sucks up some carbon. Things like debt for nature swaps, where countries are encouraged to plant more trees or engage in environmental conservation in order to ensure that there are more trees to be the carbon sink. Those would be the kinds of things that would do. Iron fertilization. Iron fertilization dumps iron into the ocean, and that sucks up carbon. Gotta make this stuff up. Adaptation counterplans would be another way to solve the impacts of climate. So you might, provide money to allow people to migrate if they need to build houses that are on stilts so that they don't get flooded, stuff like that. You could also do alternative energy not for transportation. A really, 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 really important part of this is you would have to win that transportation transportation is not key to climate change as a part of the case debate in order to win these kind of counterplans, in my opinion. You can't just be like, and now we will do solar power. You need to make sure that you are also engaging the transportation not key part of that debate. Yeah. Depends on what it does. In my opinion, things like hydrogen infrastructure, which is like building hydrogen refilling stations, that probably is stoppable. I think you could defend that that's stoppable. I think that this is not alternative energy, but I think bike lanes and stuff might also be something that might potentially lose some topicalness. And there's something else in my head. Potentially, yeah. I mean, potentially, like putting electric car places where you can plug in more easily accessible. You know, potentially that could be considered transportation. I do not think that stuff that goes on the infrastructure is topical. So I don't think you should be like, and now we will fund electric cars, because that's not transportation infrastructure in my opinion. I think it'd be harder to defend that. Does that distinction make sense to everybody? Who's still listening? All right. Okay. Then the other set of counterplans would be to regulate emissions by solving consumption in some other way. So, for example, high-speed rail can solve climate because it creates an alternative to driving or to airplanes, which are much more carbon intensive. So you could have another way to regulate carbon emissions in order to solve that. There's something called cap and trade. Cap and trade is a program where the government sets a limit on carbon emissions. Businesses have to adhere to that or risk fines. They get credits where they can trade. So if I own a company and I have 5 credits under my limit, I can sell that to Lydia's company who happens to be 5 over. I make a profit, she avoids the fines, we cut emissions. RES is Renewable Energy Standard. Sometimes it's also called Renewable Energy Portfolio. This is a standard set by the government that electricity must be generated by a certain percentage of alternative energy. So electric companies like TXU in Texas would have to generate 20% of their electricity not from coal but from some other alternative energy source. SPS, anybody did SPS last year? Yep. So climate was a big advantage, and so you could do that. Okay? And there are about 50 million other ideas about, there are like 5 million other ways in which you can accomplish that. Okay? Alright. So Brian and Sullivan are going to demonstrate this debate for you. So you can have a 10-minute break and then be back in here in 10 minutes, which is at 10:42.